Welcome to FDA Imports, Cross-Border Compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hello and welcome to FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of legal challenges, compliance, and the complex landscape of regulations that shape global trade. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and in today's episode, we are going to discuss pharmaceutical imports, commerce and CBP tariffs, and that dreaded number 232. Benjamin, welcome back.
Hi, how are you doing, Kevin? Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. And wow, things are flying by fast with issues around importing FDA-related products like foods and drugs and cosmetics and medical devices. Last month, you had a guest on this podcast and talked about reciprocal tariffs. In fact, you had some predictions about the reciprocal tariffs, what they might mean. Now we are a couple weeks past April 2nd. How did your crystal balling go?
Great question. It actually went, well, I would say it went great in that we were right. Although I wouldn't.
You didn't want to be right.
I wouldn't necessarily call it great. But the big question there primarily was whether or not what reciprocal tariffs meant. We talked about the fact that there was no legal definition for it, and so it was a little bit up in the air as to what it was going to mean. However, we did some research. You may recall we had Sergio Lozano as a customs broker down in Miami at Alpha Brokers on with me, and we talked about the possibility of what it could mean. And we went through some of Trump's statements during his address to the full Congress and identified that he was talking about more than just duty, more than just tariffs, but also taxes and then other barriers to trade. And we were correct. Now, the question, and that meaning that the government started totaling up all these costs and expenses when someone in the United States export U.S.-made goods to the other country. And if we just count tariffs, then we're talking about a small percentage of the cost associated with importing U.S. goods into that foreign country. And in fact, it looks like the government has done what we thought they were going to do, which was to calculate also things like VAT in the EU, which is can be quite high when you're importing goods into the EU. Other costs associated with the importation of goods, fees at the port, fees in the shipyards, all these different expenses. And now what they didn't look like they didn't go one for one, product by product, harmonized tariff schedule code by code. And instead they did an average, which is probably the only way that they could do it. But they didn't go as high as they could have. The U.S. government could have gone substantially higher in almost every instance. And so it is about 50% of the costs total, right? Tariff plus taxes plus the cost of these other compliance requirements. And they would be calculated up to a certain number. Let's say it calculates up to, $100 per 100%, or let's call it 70% of the value of the goods. So they could have gone to 70%, whereas the tariff portion of that might only be, say 9%. All that gap are taxes and expenses other than tariff duties. So they could have gone to 70%, but instead of going to 70, they might have gone like to 35, right? They went to about half of what they could have when they totaled all those things up across the board, pretty much, excluding China, which there's now, without question, sort of a tit for tat going on today. In fact, China just went up to 245%. U.S. went to 245% of Chinese goods. Cost
I didn't see that.
Yeah, that was today. So that was another reciprocating tariff that the current administration here in the U.S. applied to China.
I saw that China retaliated with they're not sending precious metals here anymore, right?
Yeah, that's that and a number of other things, precious metals, rare earths, and those kinds of things. There's been a lot of concern about that. I can assure you, I can just say that this is not sort of the first time that there's been a potential threat or risk to those kinds of metals, which of course are very, very critical actually to national security.
Right.
So the U.S. knows how to stockpile, and I'm pretty sure we're stockpiled, right? Okay. I'm pretty sure we have what we need. But at the same time, not a pleasant thing to consider. The question I think is, which of the two countries has the ability to suffer through for longer than the other? Mm-hmm. And the likelihood is that the U.S. is in a far stronger position than China would be. But so that goes to the reciprocal tariff piece that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and we're now a couple of weeks into it. And already there does seem to be a lot of countries that are coming to the United States in order to negotiate, resulting in essentially a ratcheting down for 90 days in order to give opportunity for those countries to negotiate with the various agencies here in the United States that they would have to. So that's I guess my summary on the report card and our crystal balling associated with what reciprocal tariffs might mean. So we were right, unfortunately. Although it's nice to be right, there's times when I wish I were wrong.
Yeah, right.
This was one of them. So
things are always very busy dealing with FDA and customs issues, but now the U.S. Department of Commerce is in the game too. What is their role in regulating imports and international trade, and what are they doing now?
Sure. So we'll talk today specifically about 232, Section 232 of the Trade Remedies Act, which authorizes the president to impose various remedies, which include tariffs, but also other things like quotas. In fact, I just saw that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Foreign Ag Service, declared certain quotas that were in place and that are in place every year that allows for the importation of a certain amount, literally volume, of imported products containing up to certain percentages of sugar. And so they come in duty free until they hit a trigger point, and the trigger point's the volume. And I think just today there was an announcement that that trigger was hit on the 11th, on Friday. So that's another sort of example of a tariff, of a remedy other than a tariff, right? That's a quota where the government only allows a certain amount of something in. And then above that, the tariffs could be quite high. And here, Commerce has the authority to conduct investigations to determine whether or not tariffs should be imposed on various items based upon unfair trade practices, based upon the threat that the foreign goods can undermine U.S. producers and the suppliers of these products, and that threat be connected to national security. Okay, so that's what happened actually in March related to steel and aluminum, were the 232 tariffs, and they come out under Section 232, and so Commerce is responsible for evaluating the industry and evaluating whether or not these risks exist, and then proposing those tariffs, and then requesting comments, which they did with steel and aluminum, and then there were a series of tariffs that were issued as a response to that. And then very, very recently, as in like this week, they came out with the 232, the beginning of an investigation associated with pharmaceuticals, which we'll talk about. These tariffs are a little different than the reciprocal tariffs, which actually arise under something called AIPA, which is an emergency protection act that gives the president very broad authority for a short period of time. The 232 tariffs actually require more procedure. Commerce comes out, requests for information, and people have the opportunity to comment. And then at the end of the comment period, then Commerce makes its decision and determines what they're going to do with respect to any tariffs. So that's how Commerce gets into the middle of this whole tariff thing, and they're right in the middle of pharmaceuticals.
So how does an investigation by the Department of Commerce start? Like, how do they get started with that?
Yeah, so they can get started a couple of different ways. In some cases, these investigations are actually initiated by U.S. industry, somebody who believes that they're affected by the imported product. And so they might request an investigation be initiated. And that usually is not a single company, but sometimes it is. So there are times when a single company might bring a request for an investigation to the government. And then the government might initiate that investigation. The government doesn't have to, right? The government can make the determination as to whether an investigation is warranted. Once an investigation is started, then it follows a process. The other ways it can happen is the president, who's the executive of the government, can instruct Commerce to conduct an investigation. Now, what he's not doing is Trump is not telling Commerce to issue any tariffs or to establish any tariffs in the pharmaceutical industry. What he's doing is he's instructing Commerce to conduct an investigation as to whether tariffs are necessary in order to reduce the risks or a threat to U.S. national security. You might remember with the COVID events that we all became aware, and some, in fact, most people in America became aware for the first time. I was completely aware of it, that the majority of pharmaceuticals and medical devices and other kinds of medicaments that are necessary for health, and then when you have an event like COVID, right? You have a pandemic going on, and you have a very widespread effect of that. That the majority of those products are made overseas, and so that can certainly pose threats to the U.S. economy and threats to the national security. And this is the government's argument. So that's what Commerce is doing now, is responding to the president's instruction to conduct the investigation. So they issued the notice in the Federal Register. I think it was actually published. The pre-notice went out yesterday, and it was published today, I think. It might be the 14th, maybe Monday. I'm sorry, let me give you the dates. So April 14th or 15th came the pre-notice publication, and then and I believe it was either the April 15th or April 16th. I think the 16th of April was when it was published in the Federal Register, and then there's a period of time to provide comments, and those comments are due on May the 2nd. So anybody can comment to one of these things and provide their opinion, answering the questions. Commerce asks specific questions, looking for information that Commerce believes it needs to conclude the investigation, and then render an opinion, or render, or issue the tariffs under their authority under 232. So that's sort of how it works, and where we are in the middle of it.
Wow, that's fairly, yeah. And we've talked before about how drugs and drug ingredients kind of go back and forth from U.S. ports in various phases of development. How do you see this action by Commerce possibly affecting that?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. We have talked about the fact that pharmaceuticals come into the United States in various phases of development. It might be that the raw materials are foreign sourced, and then they come into the United States for initial manufacturing. It could be that the initial manufacturing happens overseas, and then it comes in for further manufacturing and further processing, and then maybe clinical testing or non-clinical testing. It could go back out for clinical or non-clinical testing, and then come back in for later phases of testing. So the products can come in and out in various levels of development. Every time that happens, there's an importation event, and when there's an importation event, then you've got you may very well have a duty obligation, and sometimes there are ways to minimize the impact on duty. For instance, there are prototype classifications that might be available. I help a lot of clients. We help a lot of clients with determining whether or not they can use a prototype classification for pharmaceuticals that come in either for non-clinical or clinical testing, but not for commerce. They're not intended for distribution. And the result would be exemptions. You would be exempt from the duty. So there are ways to handle that. When I look at the aluminum and steel 232s, one thing that is not allowed is what's called drawback. And drawback happens when you import product into the United States, you pay duty, and then for one reason or another, it goes back out. The goods go back out, or they get further processed and then they go back out. And then you're able to draw back the duty that you paid in the initial importation. So it's called drawback. It's the process. There's a whole industry that does that work. I don't do drawback work. Customs brokers usually do that, like Sergio, who was here. He'll do drawback work. But in the 232 investigation that Commerce did in the aluminum and the steel space, drawbacks are not permitted. So you can't use drawback as a way to try to mitigate the tariffs. You're going to pay them, and if you're going to rely on drawback, you're not going to get the money back. TIBs, temporary importation bonds, might be available. And that happens when I import product that's not intended for U.S. commerce, and I'm going to perform some manufacturing step or some step that's important to that product, and then export it back out. I can import it under bond, not for commerce, and in those circumstances, you might be able to legally avoid paying the 232s. And then, however, you have to post a bond in order to get the goods released to you to do what you want to do with them. And foreign trade zones are available. There's a couple of ways to do it, to try to mitigate it. And that matters because we still want this stuff coming in for the purposes of further processing, for clinical trials, for the purposes of advancing the product in for eventual approval and medical use. But good question. It's otherwise it will affect everything that it affects. If you go back and look at the IEEPA, the reciprocal tariff, it exempted whole swath of products that fall under a particular chapter. I want to say it was chapter 72. I forget which precise chapter, but It's the chapter where a lot of pharmaceuticals, when I say chapter, it's like the beginning of the HTS code is the chapter 72 or 73 or whatever.
Okay.
Your HTS code starts with those two numbers. But at any rate, the reciprocal tariffs excluded the chapters in the HTS code in which most pharmaceuticals reside. And consequently, they were not applied to pharmaceutical products. Now, China received its own tariffs, right? And a lot of these products come out of China. Now you have 232, which would be additive, would be on top of it. If the decision is to apply a 232 tariff, it'll be on top of whatever tariffs are already applied to the various countries. So complex, importing and exporting materials at various stages is going to be complex, but it's all doable. I don't want people to think it can't be done. It certainly can be done, and I'm helping clients even now sort of work through how to use the prototypes in order to mitigate duty in a legal way.
Things have been so up and down. First, they were these much larger, worldwide tariffs. A lot of that was pulled back, and like it's been back and forth. Let's get that England crystal ball out again. Where do you see things going in the near term? Do you think it's going to keep this back and forth? Is going to keep happening and until someone blinks? How do you feel this is going to go down?
I think that there will need to be a blinking event in the, and I'm not saying blanking event, but a blinking event.
Yeah.
In our relationship with China, I think that's going to have to happen. Someone's going to have to blink. I think when it comes to the balance, though, think about it this way: everybody talked about how bad tariffs were; it was going to crush the industry, crush the economy, and there's arguments on both sides of all that, right? And that was at a time when most things came in duty free, and so in Trump ratcheted things up all around the world. And then he's brought them back down because so many countries have indicated through, in response to the reciprocal tariffs that they want to talk. And he ratcheted them back down to 10%. And 10% probably is going to be where it sits. My expectation is that most countries will be at 10% or better if they negotiate better deals. And yet people look at 10% now as a relief. Now, I say people, right? But for the most part, most people in the industry would look at 10% as that would be a lot better than the 45 I'm looking at now, or the 76 or whatever, right? So in a sense, what he's done is he's raised the floor, probably, and I think that will be the case. That most of it will end up like in the 10% range, and then I expect that there's going to be discussions with China. Is my expectation, and there will be some negotiations that will result in some sort of a trade deal. But I'm entirely guessing at this point. I'm right about a lot of this, but there's no telling sort of how that's going to play out. I think with China.
Yeah, definitely a lot to watch here for sure. All right. Well, thanks for joining us on FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with Attorney Benjamin L. England. To connect with Benjamin, visit FDAImports.com. And don't forget to like our videos and subscribe to the channel. We got lots more stuff coming your way, and Benjamin is the perfect person to walk us through all of this chaos. So Ben, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.